Today, we're going to go over the next chapter in our book, Delivered into Covenant, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 2 by Walter Brueggemann. The chapter is entitled Sabbath, Even Here. And the little verse that he highlights is found in Exodus chapter 16, verses 25 through 26. And so we're still slogging through the 16th chapter, 3 chapters in a row. But these verses read, Moses said, "Eat it, it being manna. Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." The hard lessons taught by way of the manna in the wilderness are now compounded by a new requirement. And I say new because here is the first time that Sabbath is mentioned in the Bible. And I checked, this is the first mention of the word in the Hebrew Bible. And the people are told that they are meant to take a day of rest. And not only are they meant to do this, the incentive to break the Sabbath will be taken away from them. There will be no manna to gather on that day. And this is meant to be a gift from God, the Sabbath. It invites us, and I mean us even here today, to rest, because we all need rest. It's part of what we need to be healthy and whole persons, but it also affords us an opportunity to trust and rely on God still further. And by that, I mean as it relates to resources, because you remember they're in the wilderness and they have found that God provides enough resources for them to live well in the wilderness with the manna, but they're not meant to save any for the next day. And then now they're told that there will be one day where God will even rest and there will be no manna to fall. And the day before, they will be able to cook some and to save some, to store some up. But on that day where no manna falls, they're given another opportunity to trust and rely on God, to be able to provide even when they take a day off and take a day to not attend to what typically brings bread to the table and supplies their needs. In other words, God's abundance is so great that we can afford to take the time to put up our feet and rest. We can take time to refrain from production and simply enjoy the world and the people around us. Emphasis on refrain from production. And I say that as part of a culture and with a certain economic mindset that seems to place production in high order and high priority. So indeed, the Sabbath observance is so important to Yahweh that the people are instructed to bend the rule given back in 1619. Brueggemann writes of this, the importance of this contradiction of the older rule is that it makes clear that the Sabbath observance trumps daily dependence upon food being given. Now, I've worked at a couple of places that operated 24/7 nearly every day out of the year. I worked at a clutch plate factory in Crawfordsville when I was one summer between college years. And then when I graduated from college, I worked for 2 years at a corn mill. And both of these places worked 24/7 around the clock, first, second, and third shift. And they were both run with the mindset that, one, we must compete with others to be as productive as possible. That's why we run 24/7. Because others, all the other plants are too. And if you don't, you take some days off, you get behind, and then your competitors win. Two, if the plant rests, and if that happens, then our position, our jobs, our livelihood, the whole thing, well, it'll be precarious. And three, we're told this is simply how it is. So that you work 24/7, you come in when we tell you to, sometimes 7 days a week in both of those jobs, and you don't have to like it. And if you don't like it, you don't have to work here, is what I was told. I remember the foreman who told me that, said it. I think it was the first time I had heard the joke. You don't have to come in tomorrow, but you won't have a job, basically. And of course, we knew when we were told that that other comparable workplaces operate with the same mindset. And so even if we took them up on that offer, quit our job, the economy would likely funnel us into similar circumstances. And so we just showed up, clock in, clock out, because it's hard for our culture to conceive of a world where productivity and profits do not drive our daily practices. Similarly, the Israelites could not at first believe that they really could take a day off and still have all the daily bread they required. In verses 27 through 29 of Exodus chapter 16, we read of how they at first disregarded the new rule, and then they're reprimanded in verses 28 through 29. And then verse 30 tells of how all the people finally rested. Brueggemann writes of this: in the context of the narrative, the episode makes clear that even in the most dire circumstance of wilderness, the paradigmatic place of scarcity, Sabbath is honored and not violated due to anxiety about scarcity. One might imagine that in such an extremity, an exception about the Sabbath. One might imagine that found a typo. One might imagine that in such an extremity, an exception about the Sabbath food gathering would be made. But no necessary work is legitimate, even in such a circumstance. Israel's life is one of radical dependence upon Yahweh, and that dependence is here shown to be completely trustworthy. So as I said from the onset, this Sabbath and this break from work gives people another opportunity to trust in God's reliance. How if the ground is not worked? How if we do not show up to work on a specific day? Will everything fall apart? Will we not have enough if we don't stay busy? And God's people discover in the wilderness of all places that even there they can pause and take a breath and enjoy God's creation. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus tells a parable about a rich fool who was exceedingly productive, so much so that he was able to store up excess grain in new barns that he built to accommodate. And he is named in the parable a fool. I think that in today's culture, he would be given promotions, but in the parable, he is labeled a fool because he will soon die. And then what good are his treasures? Like rotting manna, the grain will spoil in the barn, the whole while the whole community may have been blessed by his excess grain. But that's not what he chose to do. The parable sets up one of Jesus's more memorable lines, comes immediately after that parable. Luke chapter 12, verses 22 through 23, quoting, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear, for life is more than food, and the body more than clothing." Quoting Brueggemann here, Jesus' disciples are summoned to trust the generous reliability of your Father, who knows that they need these things. Indeed, the Sabbath provision is a way of attesting that God's reliable generosity, even in the midst of rest, is more than adequate in the face of scarcity. Rest becomes a visible act of complete trust in the sustaining reliability of God, the giver of food. And as is the pattern, the lessons learned in the wilderness will come into play centuries later when the Israelites are displaced and scattered by the Babylonian occupation. But still, Sabbath was remembered even then in the centuries that followed. This practice set the people apart, separate from the death-dealing ways of empire. Brueggemann writes of this: the successful and therefore the dominant in the empire were producers and accumulators who gathered most of the food and every other tradable commodity. The practice of empire is insatiable in seeking such commodities that are secured by a monopoly of resources and by cheap labor, for there is never a Sabbath. Which, an anecdotal story, reminds me again of my time in the corn mill, which I referenced earlier. What you see, and Nancy, I know you can't see this being on the phone, but what everyone else is looking at is a picture of a 22, 23-year-old Heath covered in corn dust. I had just climbed into a machine to clean it. And I'd have to put my back against one wall and my feet on the other and literally hold myself propped up, suspended like that, while I clean the inside of these machines with an air hose. And I'd get very dirty, and sometimes the guys would come by and pound on the side to make more dust fall on my head. It was kind of fun, kind of terrible. I love to think about it now, but at the time it wasn't very much fun. But the reason I bring it up is to tell a story that I feel illustrates is one example of the ways in which our culture has completely neglected Sabbath as a concept or something that we'll even attempt to try. In that place, I would sometimes work 7 days a week without an option. It wasn't like I volunteered for overtime. I was just told. Sometimes on a Friday when I'm leaving the parking lot, I would see my supervisor in my rearview mirror flagging me down. He could see that I saw him. I had to stop. We need you to come in tomorrow. And then sometimes on the Saturday, I would be told the same thing about Sunday. Then I would have to make accommodations for the church, as I was also youth pastor on Sundays. And I remember one particular time I had banked away time off, and that was Thanksgiving. And on the calendar from the start of the year, Thanksgiving and the day that followed were set aside as a day where the corn mill would finally rest, would finally catch a breath. And I was so glad that would be one day where I just knew I could count on getting some time off. And in fact, Kelly and I planned a trip up to see her dad in the Chicagoland area. And then on the Wednesday before, I remember going into the office, or the little place where we'd run tests on corn and whatnot. And my supervisor was explaining to everybody that we had taken on a few new orders and that we were going to have everybody come in and work on Thanksgiving. And then maybe the Friday to come, because these were great orders, a lot of money to be made. And, we don't want to miss this opportunity. And I was so sick in my stomach. I threw a little bit of a fit. And I remember telling the supervisor that is un-American was the word I used. I have since come to learn that is very American, but it is anti-Christian, meaning our faith calls us to rest and to prioritize what builds families and communities and relationships and lives over profit. I don't care if somebody put in another order for some grits or some flour or whatever it was that day, some cornmeal that we made. We need to rest. And the place that ordered it needs to too, and everyone else besides. Brueggemann, towards the end of this chapter, writes the following: the point has immediate contemporaneity for Christian identity in the economy of the United States. The dominant economy is one of endless accumulation that requires 24/7 multitasking in order to gain an edge in the acquiring of commodities. The ideology of the market that dominates our common life is governed by an assumption of scarcity. There is never enough. Thus, in belated capitalism, as in exile in the wilderness, a Sabbath pause is attestation that the compulsive drive for more in the face of scarcity is a denial of the abundance of Yahweh who gives enough. The destiny of God's creatures, and most especially of God's much beloved chosen, is not accumulation. It is finally a restful confidence that God's creation is a gift that keeps on giving. Participation in a covenant with such confidence is already a disengagement from the ideology of production and accumulation. And I've included here some pictures from the era of child labor here in the United States, which happened other places and has happened other times in history too. I'm not trying to single us out, but it's where we live. And it's a reminder that there have been times where things were even worse, where we prioritized production and the cheap production of commodities so much so that we would ask children, Josie's age, to work in the conditions that you were looking at on these pictures. And it really raises the stakes for what the cost is for failing to prioritize Sabbath, which is an opportunity to trust that if we shut down the plants, we shut down the factories, we close the stores, and we all go home, the world will not break apart, and we will have enough the following day. The manna will come again. So making Sabbath keeping a priority in our culture would be a leap of faith for us all. Corporate culture would have to radically shift its mindset, its tendency to prioritize productivity over all other considerations. Politicians would then campaign on a Sabbath-inspired platform, one that ensured that we would each find time to catch a breath and enjoy the abundance of God's creation and the fruit of our labors. But alas, we dream. But that is the dream, and it's the future we hope for. So let's make it personal. And this, we're segueing into our time of comments and questions and observations, prompted by the following questions. In what ways have our own outlooks, yours and mine, been shaped by our consumer culture that fetishizes production and profit over other considerations? How might the experiences of the Israelites in the wilderness challenge our skewed perspectives? I'll bring us back up here and ask that you unmute yourselves.
Well, I don't know that I was thinking about the experience and things, but the fact of the Sabbath and what it is in today's world and everything. The first thing I think about is that, the Pharisees condemned Jesus for healing on the Sabbath, or for his disciples for picking the grains on the Sabbath. And many years ago, I found, not many years ago, a while back, in Romans 14:9, it says, one man considers one day more sacred than the other. Another man considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. He who regards one day as special does so to the Lord. And he who eats meat eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to the God. And he who abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. And so that more or less says to me that every day is a day from God, and we should treat them all equal, and remember to remember God.
That's true. That's a good point to make, that every day has moments where we can put into practice gratitude, noticing what's around us. And those passages where Jesus is chided, more than chided, is condemned, spoken against for working on the Sabbath, points towards how people can be given this great gift, which is a reminder to rest as part of their rhythmic habits, but then make it such a legalistic command that they forget that it's, it was made to make us healthy and whole. And so of course you would heal someone on the Sabbath. And in fact, there are prescriptions for what to do when, say, your oxen falls in the ditch on the Sabbath, or when things happen that are of immediate necessity. The overall point, though, is to, in keeping with the larger story of God's interaction with creation, where God rested on the seventh day. Why? Because those are the moments where you can take in what's around you, when you pause from productivity and appreciate what all of the productivity is really about, which is to bring us life and joy and happiness and contentment. And so what Brueggemann is trying to do, and what I agree with in its application, is to hold up that mindset with the mindset of any culture. And we're not the only ones. Jesus' day seems to have had similar problems with the Roman Empire and many times and places besides, where a culture has a mindset where if we stop for a moment, if we're not trying to produce as much as we can and acquire as much as we can and profit as much as we can, then we're gonna lose. The business will close, doors will shutter, we won't have enough. And what the Israelites are learning in the wilderness is, even in the wilderness, they have enough, and they can rest as well. And in this, every year, watch what they do around Black Friday sales, where they're trying to find how to stretch this moment, which is meant to be a family time where we do rest and spend it. How can we stretch that moment and pack as much productivity and sales into that time? And for what reason? You know, what do we gain? More cheap goods, DVDs, movies, new TV that you didn't need to buy, and that's really what I'm trying to talk about. But I agree, though, that when if I left here today and sat outside and caught a breath for a run, that is bringing Sabbath in my left after a pattern. I what I guess I wish, what I feel like we are missing here in our culture is it would be great if we could coordinate things in such a way that we all, regardless of our religious convictions, it doesn't have to be a Christian thing necessarily, although it is a Christian thing and a Jewish thing. But how if we all had a day in the week, like it seems it used to have been the case, where we all just took a collective breath and you knew it was coming and no one's going to tell you that you have to come into work. Ironically, the reason why liquor stores were closed on Sundays up until very recently, it was a hangover from old Prohibition era legislation. But the reason why the liquor lobbies levied so hard to keep that as a day where they were closed, the liquor stores wanted to stay closed. Why? Because it gave their employees a day to rest, and they just loved having that built in. So they're like, Prohibition on Sundays, yes. Why? We get to rest. And now that's gone. Whatever you think about that is not the point. But that's more what I'm trying to talk about here. I feel very strong.
I think if you're a provider for a family and Sunday is the day that you need to work, I think about farmers that when it's time to plant the crops or bring them in, that, you know, sometimes you only have certain times to do those things. And if that's the way you provide for your family and you don't do it, then are you doing a godly thing or not?
That's where I think those passages that you mentioned from the onset about Jesus doing life-giving work on the Sabbath are important. It's the principle more than the law. It's the spirit behind the law. And in my last church, I had several farmers in the church that would just tell me candidly, you know, we've had so much rain and we've been dry for a week. And if I don't get out in the fields now, you know, understood. And that again isn't what I'm talking about. And that's what Jesus talked a lot about too, is the spirit behind the law, like what its intent is. And its intent isn't to drive poor farmers into more desperation, you know?
Well, you think too, Bob, in the hospitals and something, we have to have people there 24/7. And,
yep.
You know, if that's your occupation, then you probably are going to be required to work some on whatever your Sabbath day is.
By all means, heal on the Sabbath. We need it. We need it. I agree.
I think that we can have Sabbath not just once a week, but many times, even small moments. To me, Sabbath is focusing on God and just taking like time out. And it's not like 7 hours and all day Sunday, that's Sabbath day. I think it's more than that. It's appreciation.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you want to be literal, God made the earth, creation in 7 days, and then God rested. One day in God's time could be 100,000 years. So that's just.
Well, as a personal spiritual practice, you know, I would not want to be dogmatic or legalistic about it. And I think that, you know, that's part of the tension here is, you know, do we all have to do it all at once and all together? Or does the practice of acknowledging Sabbath in your life call you to organize your life to allow time for rest and appreciating your friends, your loved ones, and creation, to balance that with everything else you got going on. And so if I were running a business, say I was a proprietor of a business and I was trying to organize my business along my principles as a Christian, I would want to ensure that my employees had the space and time in their lives to not be miserable, to actually see the work that they did in my place of occupation as what gave them the opportunity to have leisure and rest and moments where they could catch their breath and appreciate the work they've done and those around them. And so I wouldn't, there's one example is Chick-fil-A, who was like, we're always going to be closed on Sunday. They're doing it very much patterned after needing to be one specific day. It doesn't need to be. I think that a lot of that will depend on what it is you're talking about. Back to the corn mill, there's no reason that place needed to run every Sunday. Mm-hmm. There's just no one's going to die if we don't make the corn mill. By the way, we would mill all of the meal for Jiffy. So anytime you bought a box of Jiffy corn muffin mix, it came from a plant out of Chelsea, Michigan, and the corn mill I worked at in Marion, Indiana, was its sole supplier of cornmeal. Mm-hmm. So
it's good cornbread.
Yeah, that's you're buying local in a weird way. But my point is, you don't. I did not need to come in on Thanksgiving, but that wasn't even a Sunday or a Saturday if you were a Seventh-day Adventist. But it points towards a list of priorities. And what this teaching can do is it can allow you to say, let's not be legalistic about when it is, but let's make sure it happens in our lives. And I'm hoping someday in our culture, we went from child labor to 40-hour work week. And now it seems like we're not child labor, but we're wages are going down, hours are getting longer. People are needing to sometimes to provide for their house, work all the time. And it doesn't have to be that way. And that's I guess the point I'm trying to make. So, but I do agree with all the points you're making, Janet and Sue, about, it doesn't have to be rigid and legalistic. And I love the stories about Jesus around the Sabbath, where he busts it wide open and points out, like, this is all for your well-being. And if keeping it keeps somebody from getting their healing, then
doesn't he say to one of them, now, if your cow wasn't in the ditch, would you not go and get him out on the Sabbath?
Right. Because it was already in their scripture. Yeah. There was a carve out for what to do,
So on earlier on Thursday on another Bible study, I'm doing Ezekiel. And the priests and things are asking, shall I mourn and fast on the 5th month as I've done for many years? And the reply came back from the Lord, ask all the people of the land and the priests, when you fast and mourn on the 5th and 7th months for the past 70 years, was it really for me that you fasted? And when you were eating and drinking, were you not just feasting for yourselves? Are these not the words of the Lord proclaimed through earlier prophets? So perhaps sometimes we do it because we've done it. And we've lost out on the reason why we're setting aside the Sabbath and not thinking about the Lord or thanking him for everything he's done for us.
When I was growing up, there was this balancing act in my house as to what constituted too much activity on the Sabbath. So I begging my dad to let me go fishing, and he wanted to let me, but he was also like, well, he's thinking about it from a legalistic mindset. Is baiting the hook and getting everything ready and going down there, and if you catch a fish and you clean it, is all of that too much? And so sometimes I would have maybe a half hour's debate on the way home from church about, please, Dad, the weather's fine, let me go fishing. And sometimes he'd let me, and other times his convictions would keep him like, I just don't know if I feel right about it. And it seems like that misses the point. How does a 12-year-old Sabbath? He might go fishing. It's great. It's an appropriate use of your time if you're trying to rest, you know? To me, that's communion with nature. That's but these stories really help illustrate the it's more about the spirit of the law here than how it gets applied.
That reminds me of, well, there was this one place in Rushville, Indiana, that was a drugstore, and they were open probably because they had to be, to sell drugs and be open. And so they had ice cream. So we'd always head there so we could get an ice cream cone. But everything was closed. I mean, any of the well, we didn't even have malls when I was little. JCPenney, all of them were closed. I'm trying to remember what started opening up. I can't even remember.
That came through better, Janet. I was only told about the world you're describing. It's in a similar way where people would recall growing up how nothing was open. And that I think would be great. As long as it wasn't done out of a legalistic, mindset where it was like, kind of like what we've been describing, where it was more of an understanding that, hey, we all need a break. We all need a rest. And it was done as a almost like a public health gesture, let's make sure that our collective are rested. Not as like some legal code that you break it, you make God mad and everything's, falls apart or something. But I would love if, I realized that whenever the kids have a snow day, for example, the thing that I most appreciate is everything stops and no one expects me to do anything because no one can. It'd be great if snow days were just built in.
Snow or not.
Snow or not. This is
snow days.
Yeah, they try to build them in on the calendar.
Oh, it would be more fun if it wasn't on the calendar. If just all of a sudden they just said, okay, tomorrow's a snow day.
Yeah, or like Memorial Day was, Memorial Day's great, or Labor Day. More of that. more of that is what I'm saying. Not to be a bunch of lazy bones, but just because we need that. And if all of your friends had it on the same day, then you knew you could hang out with them, and you knew that you could give a call on that day, and you'd expect, with the exception of those jobs in roles that really need 24/7 attention. Anyway,
I have to admire Chick-fil-A. I'm sorry.
You're breaking up still, but I think what I heard you say is that you do admire Chick-fil-A for doing that, but we've all been there, probably driven up on a Sunday and be like, oh yeah, it's not open today. And
it's not hurting their business.
No,
they seem to be doing very well. Yeah. They are able to collect what they need on a Saturday and close down, and the world doesn't fall apart.
Right.
Yep.
I think now they call it contemplation. Like Stanford has contemplation by design, and they talk about the power of the pause. So you just stop and pause. And you exhale, you breathe in, breathe out, exhale, and then you attend to what is happening, the sounds of nature or whatever. Then you connect to the now. And I think then after that you express your feelings. So they call it peace, contemplative practice. It's very hard for me to be in the now, like talk about meditation and contemplation and being in the present moment. It's because we have so many things we're doing. Now, if I want to watch a TV show, the only time I could watch it was during my dinner hour, so I could, because I didn't have time otherwise. But a lot of monastics, and I'm talking about eating, is to really taste the food and be in the present moment.
Mm.
And and I think sometimes when we take that time to pause, like you say, it's like taking Sabbath moment. It's just to pause.
Thank you. Yes. This is again another we can take Sabbath any number of times it as over the course of our day. It doesn't have to be confined to any one time, but the important thing is that we find time. The problem from an individual's perspective, like yours and mine, is simpler because we know our schedules and we could figure out maybe, unless we're spread way too thin, figure out when we could let something go and take a rest. The larger problem is what to do about the way that our culture is currently, the way we currently are together. Because when I was working at that corn mill, I couldn't find time.
No.
I could not. And when I did have time, I was so tired, I couldn't appreciate my food or nature. And I left there, but the folks that I worked with are still there, and they had an attitude of just resignation to it. You'd say, how are things? What's the good news? And then the counter answer was, there isn't any. That was like what they'd always say to greet you. It's like terrible, but that was said all the time, and there was even when I griped about not getting that Thanksgiving off, some of the people who'd put in decades there were annoyed at me, this up and comer who wasn't willing to put in the time as they had done, giving up their Thanksgivings, giving up, and for what? Jiffy corn muffin mix. It
Sounds pretty ludicrous when you put it that way.
yeah. Now that to his credit, the supervisor went back to the office and came back and let me know that he had talked the powers that be to pause on it. We'll fill that order, but we're going to take Thanksgiving off, and we got it. So I was in the 11th hour, the hour before we left for the day, we were told, okay, I guess you're not coming in tomorrow.
Well, and that's a pretty brazen line to take. People who have already made plans, like you and Kelly had already made plans. You had always been guaranteed that day off, and then just to throw it at you the day before is.
I'm trying to paint a picture of an atmosphere, a work climate, and it's still there, and it's lots of places bigger than that corn mill, and it's not good for us. Well, we're almost at our hour. Thank you for this conversation. If you can find time to rest today, I hope you do. If not, maybe find some time later. And in the meantime, let's hope and pray that this way of Sabbath that our culture can convert to it, because we need it pretty bad.
Yeah.
There are some businesses that are going to 4-day work weeks, 10 hours a day, and so that they have Friday, Saturday, and Sundays off.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Lovely. Well, you all take care. And I'll see next week. We are not going to be having our Bible study. I forgot that I am going camping with Kelly's stepmom and stepdad, the ones who live here in Indiana. Yeah. I'm sorry for the late notice, but it's my fault. I was told 2 months ago, but I forgot. So next Thursday, no Bible study. We'll send out an email to remind you of that. But then the Thursday after that, we'll see that would be, help me out here, June. The next one would have been on June 9th. So the next one will be on the 16th, June the 16th.
We'll have a happy Sabbath Thursday.
Yes. Yeah. Perfect. Take care. I'll see you all soon.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.